Hi there. In this episode, we're going to continue working in Maya. I'm going to show you how to render out a video from an animation so that you have a playable video that is a final rendered animation. So I've loaded in my model from my previous episode. This is the model where I've created a turntable animation. So if you remember, we can play this and see a turntable animation. And I'm going to show you how you render this out as an animation. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a little bit more lighting just to make this more interesting. I don't want to mess up my turntable rendering, so I'm going to actually change back to the regular camera. And I do that by going to Panel, Perspective, PRSP, which is the standard perspective view. And now I can just see the whole thing, including the camera that's going to be the turntable camera. As before, you can combine this with the first episode about lighting to improve your lighting quality. And I'm going to quickly add a few light sources just to do that. So just add a few lights just to create a renderable scene here. Move the light sources around. Turn on the lighting using all default lights and turn on shadows. Because this is going to be rotating all the way around, I'm going to add lights on a few different places. We could potentially use what's called three-point lighting, which is a common kind of lighting practice in which you place at least 3 lights that surround the object to give a kind of a sense of depth. I've created 3 lights at different positions here. In cinematography, those would be placed in very careful positions to provide kind of different lighting effects, but right now I'm just going to kind of place them somewhat arbitrarily in space around the object, so just I have the object totally illuminated. Shadows are on, so I can see kind of subtle shadows if I want to. And I'm also going to kind of just very quickly put in, using the hypershade, which we learned about in our first episode, to create a very simple material. So I'm just going to create a Phong object material here, select it, apply my Phong material, maybe change the glossiness or the color a bit, and that's probably enough for now. I think I'm also going to create a ground plane, but because I want to do a turntable, maybe I'll do it a little differently. I'm going to do it using a cylinder instead. So I'm going to go to polygonal modeling, deselect, so I have nothing selected. Going to go to the cylinder tool, which makes a cylinder here, and that will make a small one in the center. I need to scale it up, so I'll scale it up. And I can see I don't want it to be scaled. I'm going to make a turntable, so I don't want it to be scaled exactly the same on each axis. I'm going to kind of flatten it down by only scaling in one direction. And I use the plane scaling to scale it out in the other two. So that way I can flatten it down and also scale out as well. Okay. I'll position it just slightly below my model perhaps. And that gives a good view. So I need to double check, so that's kind of a nice view. I get the shadows appearing on the table. A pretty good view. I need to double check my camera and make sure that the render camera, when I render it from this camera, is going to be correct. It actually looks pretty good. So this is potentially what I could use for my rendering. And now I'm ready to kind of render out to a movie, at least for this first try. So how do we do that? There are a few different settings for rendering, and I'll just go through them one by one. So they're again found in the rendering icon here on the top bar. So click the rendering settings. I'll just go through these one by one so that we can understand how they affect what happens. The first thing is we're going to make sure that we're in Maya software. Go into software rendering. I'm going to change the production quality to preview quality. This is because it can take a long time to do production quality, and you may not have enough time to do this. So I want to keep the rendering times short because it's your first experiment. Of course, you can always push up the quality later if you want. but I want your first renderings to happen fairly quickly. So we're going to do preview quality. That's just to make things happen quickly. But I do want to give you a little bit of quality, a little bit of enhanced rendering. So we're going to leave ray tracing on. We're going to leave ray tracing with enabled, but we're going to set this to preview quality. And we'll make sure that we have a reasonable rendering time. Now, all the other settings are going to be done in common. So there's a few different things here. The first thing is we want to give our output files a name. So I'm just going to call this my movie. We need to choose a format. So this is how we're going to render out. Now, you could potentially render to a movie file, but this is not consistent between Mac and PC, and it's error prone and can be difficult. So I want to show you the more professional way to do this, which is to render to images. Now, the real right way to do this, if we're professionals, would be to render to a Maya IFF, which is a high quality image format. We're going to render to JPEGs. And that's going to create individual frames, individual images. The reason I don't want to make a movie is because it has to compile the entire movie. And that can be error prone. So if it gets a problem in between, you end up losing the whole thing. When you render out individual images, for example, as JPEGs, as individual, you have 400 frames to render. They're going to be rendered as separate files. If you do them as separate files, then you can pick up where you left off. You can easily see how it's progressing. So we're going to do JPEG. And we're going to change the name to number.extension. So it's going to create 400 images, and they're going to have this name, which is my movie, dot the number, which is going to be the frame number 0, 1, 2, counting up 400. So I get 400 frames. And then it will add the JPEG extension. So this technique is kind of the preferred technique for rendering movies because you end up with a sequence of images that you can then turn into a movie if you want. And I'll show you how to do that. So this is the key setting here, is making it a JPEG so that it renders as separate frames. Now there's several other settings here. We need to tell it how much of the movie we want to render, how much of the animation. So we give it a start frame of 1. We send our ending frame to 400. And this tells it we want to render every single frame. So we do it 1. So it's saying counting from 1 to 400, we're going to render 400 frames. We need to select which camera we're going to view this from. We want to render, and we do not want the default camera because this is our perspective camera. We want the camera that we created that has the turntable animation. So we're going to select camera 1 as the camera for our animation. So that tells it what type of file, how long we're going to save, how long are we going to render, which camera we're going to use, and now we finally need to tell it the image quality or the resolution, the amount of detail in images. I would like you to use the HD 540 for this. Now, you could render much higher quality images. You could go to like 1080p, which is like high definition, but that's going to take a lot longer to render. So you're going to spend a lot more time waiting for it to render. So for this, because I want the renders to happen quickly, I want you to use HD 540. So the width is 960, the height is 540. So those are the basic rendering settings. This is to create a batch renderer. We've given a name. We've specified that we want it to do a sequence of images, not just a movie. It's going to render a set. It's going to render 400 images for every frame of our movie using this camera and using an image size of 960 by 540. So those are the settings. I'm going to close this, and now I'm going to save my file. I want to save my scene because I want to save those settings so I don't have to re-enter them all. So my settings will be saved. Now I'm ready to render. If I just click this, I'll just render one frame, right? And that's going to be whatever frame I'm currently looking at. I want to render batch, and so that's what these icons here are for. These yellow icons are batch rendering, and they allow us to render our whole sequence as a sequence. There are a few different options here, and I'll go through them. So batch render is the thing that starts it. So we're going to click on that, and that will start we have to save this, depending on which version we're using. That will start the batch render. It may not look like anything happened. It's not going to show you anything right away. That's because most of the rendering is designed to happen in the background and let you do other stuff and continue working. So if we want to see it working, we click on this, which shows us the progress of the rendering. Okay. Now, what we're seeing here is the renderer is working in the background, trying to calculate all of those 400 frames. If we look at the ending here, where it says My Movie 003334, that is the frame number it's currently working on. So it's rendering the 40th frame, the 43rd frame, the 45th frame. It's going to do all 400 frames and gradually work through creating a movie of all of those frames. This percentage rendering shows you how long it's taking on the current frame. So if you're making a more complicated rendering, it could be taking a lot of time just on one frame. So you basically have to wait for the rendering to finish. With these settings, it should take between 5 and 7 minutes. So with a 960 by 540 size, 400 frames of a fairly simple scene should take a few minutes. You can see that it's about through 100 of them, which is about a quarter of the way already. A few other things that we can do while we're waiting for that render to finish. We can click on the batch show batch render, which shows us what it's currently working on. It's going to give us kind of a snapshot of where it is in the whole process. I can click that again, and I might see that it's working on a different frame. So it just lets you kind of preview, well, how far along is it getting? The idea is that you can continue working and continue editing your scene, and once in a while check in and see how far along it is. This last one to know about here is cancel. In case you decide you want to cancel it and start over, you can just cancel a rendering and then start a new one and change settings and start a new one. So that's basically it. We can see how far along it is again by clicking on the batch render and check. So where did it put all these images? If we go to the settings panel, the render settings, we can see that it tells us the path of where it placed them. So this is in documents, which is going to be my documents, my project images. So this will tell me where those images ended up. If I go to that location with the browser or just the Finder, I'll see that there are my sequence of images. This is 400 frames that are rendered out that represent that turntable animation that I've created over 400 frames. There's going to be quite a lot of files. If you click on any one of them, you should see one of those frames. Okay. The last step here is to compile them into a movie. And we're not going to do that in Maya. Maya is really kind of not the ideal tool for compiling a movie from images. So we're going to use a different program. Depending on your preferences, you can use something like FFmpeg or some other tools. We're going to do it in AfterFX. AfterFX is kind of a simple way to compile movies if you have it. So let's take a look at how we would make this into a final movie in AfterFX. So I have AfterFX here. I've opened it up. I'm going to create a new project or start a new composition. And the first thing is, how big does it need to be? Well, we know when we created our movie that we created it at its particular size, and that size was 960 by 540, which is HD 540. So we're going to put in 960 by 540, and we're going to set our frame rate to 30, which matches the size and the frame rate that we used when we made our animation. Okay, so that creates a workspace that has the correct size. Now we need to bring their images in. We do that by right-clicking in the composition area. We say import file. We don't want multiple files because we don't want them to come in as separate files. We want them to come in as one animation. So we're going to do import file. We're going to go to the correct location, which here is kind of documents my project defaults images. And we should see them all. We're not going to select them all because, like I said, we just want them to come in as a sequence. So what we do is we select the first one, and this is the key right here, is we're doing import JPEG sequence. That's going to say that we want these to all come in as if they were one movie. So we're not loading separate files. We're choosing the first one and telling it that this is going to be imported as footage as a sequence. So now we just click the import button, and we don't have multiple here. We just have one that comes in as footage. We can now drag drop that down to the timeline, and we should be able, if we want to, just press the space bar to play this. So this is the first time that we're going to have a chance to see what our rendering looks like. And it looks pretty good. So this gives us kind of a preview of our final movie. And now we're ready to actually make the single movie file. So here's how we make a movie file. We go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. So this is a render queue. Render is different than Maya's render. This render is basically rendering an After Effects composition, which is images. We have some settings here. We need to quickly change these to output what we want. We click on the lossless button here. This lossless is the output and the output module. We're going to change this to QuickTime. So we're going to make a QuickTime movie. And we want the format to be Apple ProRes 422. So it may have started as something else. We choose the video codec to be Apple ProRes 422. Click OK. And we don't have audio, so we can just say audio output off and turn off the audio. That's all we need to do. We're just telling it the kind of format that we want. So we click OK. We also need to tell the file we want to save it to. We're going to save a QuickTime movie. So I'm just going to save it on the desktop as a movie. And that should be it. If we click Render now, so this is queued, it's ready to go. But to actually render, we click this button on the very right, which is Render. And this should happen very fast because it's just compiling these frames into a movie. It's not actually doing a deep render. It's just should happen quickly. Now, this end part of it, it's too long and it's all black. So if we look at our movie, we may see or something. So on Mac, it should be fine. So here's my movie. I'm finally getting a chance to see this. And I should be able to see the whole thing render. It's kind of black at the end because there's something I need to remember, and that is, I'm going to do this again and just show you what was missing. If you go back to the composition window, which is where I've created this, we can see that the top bar here represents the rendering duration, and that rendering, that output duration is longer than my clip. So this other stuff here just ends up being black. So this is 400 frames from here to here, but I have an extra set of frames where there's nothing. So I just need to bring in the clip duration so that that matches. Now I can go and again go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. I will see potentially multiple previous renders here, and if I want, I can just delete the old ones. So the new ones appear at the bottom. I can always just go back, delete some of the previous ones if I want. And I want to set the settings again because it will not necessarily get them each time. Make sure this is Apple ProRes 422 and output audio off. And now I've set the file name. I'm just going to overwrite the same file. And now I click Render, and I should render out movie. Like I said, it should happen pretty quickly. And this time, the ending really is the ending of my movie. That's it. Something else, I find this and run it, I should be able to see my rendering. Okay, that's it. I hope you'd enjoyed this. That's it for turntable renderings. We'll be moving on to other topics in the future, and thanks for watching. Bye.